Okay. Hello, my name is Lucas Walsh, and today I'll be presenting machine learning approaches to growth, maturation, relative age effects, and performance in youth soccer. To begin, the youth sports market is estimated at over $40 billion annually, and in youth soccer alone, there are over 265 million players registered with FIFA alone. The youth academies that these players are registered with form the backbone of professional elite pathways, and the foundation for a player's journey in these academies can begin as early as age 6. So these are lifelong pipelines that lead to professional clubs like Manchester City and Arsenal. These academies organize players by their chronological age, and this is important because selection and evaluation often occur during rapid growth phases. So the performance of these athletes and their position assignment might reflect factors other than age, namely differences in biological maturation and the relative age effect, which both create and distort bias in talent identification, training equity, and retention. The relative age effect is a widely studied phenomenon where early-born athletes are advantaged due to cutoff grouping. It's robust across male team sports, and it's a significant issue because it's a purely chronological selection bias that has huge impacts in confidence, self-regulation, and dropout rates among youth athletes. In terms of adolescence and physical performance, we see the largest variability, which is called peak height velocity, during adolescence, and this creates major variance in speed, jump, and agility. And then the time at which an athlete can experience their peak height velocity is both different between boys and girls, and also differs among athletes individually. So we can see that here, that significantly among athletes, it can vary greatly. This is important because in terms of maturation, we see a huge increase in speed, strength, power, and agility as we approach peak height velocity, and then after that, these improvements tend to plateau. So maturation is a critical context for interpreting youth performance. Moving on, machine learning is defined as the self-learning of computer algorithms to solve a task. Its goal is to approximate functions with near human levels of intelligence, and it's used for classification and regression by many businesses worldwide. In terms of youth athletic prediction, it's important because it's nonlinear and multivariate, so we can model the complex interactions among these variables and then explain them in the sports context. Moving on to my literature review, Cobley et al. Looked to quantify the relative age effect, and they were able to confirm it across multiple sports, exceeding the standard athlete birthday distribution, which would be expected to be uniform, and they found that it was stronger in adolescence. As we can see here, in junior and adolescent years, we have a greater relative age effect, and then again in competitive and representative sport levels. Helston et al. Looked to test the strength and prevalence of the relative age effect, specifically in youth soccer systems, and they found that early-born players were again consistently overrepresented, which supports the idea that older players are favored in a given age band. In Mush and Grandin et al., they set up a framework for the relative age effect, and it shows the negative feedback loop, where coaches favor athletes that are born earlier in the cutoff year, and then they're given more resources, which compounds the advantage, and it just continues on and on, so these athletes are favored more and more over time. Mirwald et al. Is a foundational piece of research in this field that looks to estimate peak height velocity without invasive measurements, so they use a regression equation to estimate when an athlete is going to hit their growth spurt, and it's simple, non-invasive, and practical. This is the accuracy of the equation, so on the whole it's fairly accurate and it's very non-invasive, so it will be used in this study. And it takes into account sitting height, leg length, weight, and age, and then calculates maturity offset, and from that we can determine an athlete's age at which they're going to hit their growth spurt. So Molina et al., they looked at biological maturation, and they found that it's what drives size, strength, and speed variation, and it's more representative than chronological age. And then Moore et al., they looked at sprint adaptations, and again, the sensitivity was greater before peak height velocity rather than after. So the gap in the research is that relative age effect and biological maturation, while they're both important biases to look at in youth sports, they're not studied in conjunction. Prior analysis that look into these are descriptive rather than predictive, and they lack machine learning representation as well. So, what's the goal? The goal is we're going to quantify the relationship between relative age, position, biological maturation timing, position, and then performance and chronological age. And I hypothesize that relative age and biological maturation will both have explanatory power in position assignment, and that the performance improvements will once again align with maturity rather than chronological age. So all this data was provided under an anonymized data license from Kidman Labs, or 3 youth soccer academies which spanned ages U19 to U18, U9 to U18, and they were de-identified and accessed under a licensed data agreement, and then all analysis were performed in Python. I had 3 data sets, which included standing height, sitting height, leg length, body mass, as well as counter movement jump tests and additional sprint and benchmark tests, and then a retention status if an athlete was kept on the team from 1 year to the next. I merged the 3 data sets using the anonymous athlete IDs, and then I defined the relative age using birth quartiles, and then used the neural equation to estimate peak height velocity. So the maturity variables were going to be aligned to peak height velocity, so we create a biological timeline for the research. I used XGBoost, which is a type of machine learning, to compare relative age and position and relative age versus performance. And it was trained as a classifier model, so it's trying to predict what position group an athlete might be in, given the data from the data set. The first question, which looked at relative age and position, we found that on the whole, across positions goalkeeper, defender, midfielder, and forward, athletes born in the first quarter of the year are significantly overrepresented. We can see that here as well, across all positions, athletes born in the first quarter of the year, more than 50%, so it's more than double what you would expect with a normal distribution. The second question, which looked at biological maturation and position, I trained 2 XGBoost models to classify the accuracy of relative age and maturation, and the model, when it was trained with maturation as opposed to just birth quartile information, it performed much better. And then the most important feature of the model that was looking at maturation was, of course, peak height velocity. And then we can see here, this is a diagram of the peak height velocity age by position groups. So goalkeepers, on average, they had the earliest age at which they hit their growth spurt, and then midfielders had the latest. The third research question, which looked at performance developments across maturity, we found that as we approach peak height velocity, we can see an increase in both counter movement, jump, and sprint tests. However, once we surpass peak height velocity, these improvements tend to plateau, which aligns with previous findings. So the relative age effect was confirmed. We had a 60% peak quarter 1 representation, and the accuracy of the birth quartile model was about 51.5%, which is a weak predictive capability. However, when we included maturation info, the predictive capability increased, and goalkeepers had the earliest mean peak height velocity age, which leads us to the conclusion that physical maturation is what drives position assignment. We also saw an increase in counter movement jump and sprint tests across the peak height velocity window, and like I said, this aligns with previous research as the sensitivity varied across maturation. So one takeaway from this is that we can implement something known as biobanding, which is where athletes are grouped based on their biological maturation rather than chronological age. So this would reduce the physical mismatch that is inherent to chronological age-based teams and reduce the selection bias, improving skill expression and long-term development. Some limitations of this study include that the estimated peak height velocity age was unavailable for about half of the data set because of missing measurements. The Muir-Wald maturity offset equation has some error built into it. However, it's very non-invasive, so it was used in this study. The limited subset that I had of the youth soccer academies, and then error inherent in machine learning models given their simplicity and the potential for overfitting. So future research should look to incorporate more longitudinal anthropometric data, expand to other academies and sports, and then look at the impact of biobanding and other talent assessments. So in conclusion, the aim of this research was to provide explanatory power to relative age, maturation, and performance metrics in youth soccer development, and the study concluded that maturation-aligned variables are better predictors of position than chronological ones, so they should be used in youth athlete frameworks. I'd like to thank Kidman Labs as they provided the data. My mentors, Dr. Joachim Bernstein and Mrs. Ray Hamill, are both from there. My science research teacher, Ms. Joan Ronaldo, my science research peers, friends, and family. Here are my citations. Thank you.
My name is Nicholas Lawson, and I will be conducting research involving the ciliation of MOF NH2UIO66 under the guidance of my mentor, Dr. Matthew Green at Arizona State University. At this time, if there are any questions for Lucas, they may be asked now.
Yeah. So the question was, do I think that they would switch to a maturation-based framework for youth sports? I'm hopeful that it might happen, but it would be so difficult to implement, especially in the United States. The idea of teams being based on age is just ingrained in the sports culture here. So I'm hopeful that it might happen, but I think it would be very, very difficult, and it would require a lot of long-term systemic changes to youth athletics.